Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Today we've got a topic that's a time-sensitive topic, and it's one that, we hear a lot about, but it doesn't always come into play. I mean, to be honest with you, in my years of fishing professionally, I can think of only like one or two tournaments where I've ever had this scenario come into play. And specifically what I'm talking about is a shad kill. And what I mean by shad kill is, not just the typical die-off that happens every year, but I'm talking like a serious shad kill. With the weather conditions that we've had now throughout the country, there's a lot of lakes that are froze over in areas that never have ice. I mean, I'm talking way down south, Kentucky, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Texas. I mean, there are lakes that don't normally have ice, or when they do get ice, it's on like a once every 10 years or 15 years. So what this is going to do is cause a major shad die-off. So what I want to talk about today is how to approach it and what the best baits are, in my opinion, my best shad kill baits. So the first thing I just want to state is, you would think that if there's a big shad die-off, that there's going to be really good fishing. You go out there, find the shad, and you catch fish because the fish are gorging themselves on the shad. The problem with that is that there's so many shad that are dying that the fish aren't really competing for your baits. I mean, they're just going to go, they're going to eat a couple of shad, and a lot of time the shad are pretty decent size. And when you're talking about really cold water anyways, the fish metabolism is really slow. So one shad will last that fish for a while. So they're not looking at eating 400 shad that are dying in front of them. In fact, I mean, it's really to the point where these fish kind of can say, do I want that dying shad? Do I want that one? Do I look below me and see a bunch on the bottom? It's really creates difficult fishing a lot of times. So what I'm looking to do is try to get away from the huge populations of shad. If you've got a creek that is just chock full of shad and they're dying off left and right, I try to avoid that. I actually will kind of start going the other direction, looking for areas where I've got much smaller clusters of shad. I'm not looking for a creek that is so thick with shad I can't read the bottom with my depth finders. And by doing that, what I feel like I'm doing is I'm now allowing my bait to stand out more amongst the shad that are dying off. It's just one of those things that kind of goes against what you've always been told, which is to look for the bait and you'll find the bass. That is true, but you'll find bass scattered throughout the lake as well. Even if there's not much shad, there'll be bass around. And and the other thing I want to point out is this isn't just for bass. If you're looking for any, all species that eat shad will be taking advantage of a shad die-off. So you're going to be, no matter what species you're after, crappie, walleye, bass, you're going to run into probably some tough fishing. Before I get into the baits, the other thing I want to point out is what happens during the shad die-off. Typically, the shad just don't have the systems to deal with the cold water, and that's what causes them to die. But when they die, they don't just float up to the surface. I think most people assume that shad, when they die, they float to the surface, because when you find a big fish kill, the fish are all floated up and on the banks. But typically what happens is the fish actually fall to the bottom first, and they die, and they're on the bottom of the lake. And when they decompose, they create different gases, which then float the bodies, and then that floats them to the shoreline, which is when you see the effects of a big fish kill. So having that in mind, you want to realize that those, a lot of times the fish that are feeding are actually on the bottom eating dead shad off the bottom. you know, when a shad dies, usually what'll happen is, you know, they'll kind of slowly sink, and then they'll kick up a little bit and slowly sink, kick up, or they'll, you know, float to the bottom and get a little strength and try to swim off and then float back to the bottom. So they're not moving fast. They're really easy meals for the fish to eat, and it becomes hard to compete against that with artificial baits. But here are the baits that I like. Right off the bat, you know, my favorite is a jerkbait. Any sort of jerkbait, you know, whatever your favorite jerkbait is, that's probably the #1 key to mimicking a dying shad. You know, you can weight them to sink a little bit if you want. You can make them weight them to sit in the water like this or like this. Everyone's kind of got their different favorite presentation with a jerkbait and how the jerkbait should sit in the water. But realistically, it's a great presentation that mimics a dying shad. So you should always have a jerkbait in the boat with you. My next favorite is one that I don't hear a ton of people talk about, but it's just a lipless crankbait. You know, this war pig has become one of my favorites. And the key with this, for me, is I don't fish it necessarily the same way as I would a normal a lipless crankbait. I throw it out to the bottom, I let it sink to the bottom, and then I give it nice steady strokes off the bottom, and then I let it fall back. So I'm basically yo-yoing it off the bottom. And what that does is that mimics a lot of those shad that have fallen to the bottom and then kick up and then fall back to the bottom. And that's when you'll trigger a lot of those fish. If there's fish down there and you've got dead shad laying on the bottom, if one tries to flee, that's when you'll trigger that reaction strike from the bass. And I find that yo-yo presentation is a great way to do it, and a lipless is a great way to fish a yo-yo presentation. So that's a must-have as well for me. The next, again, is probably no big surprise, just a simple small swim bait. I prefer smaller swim baits because I think they're easier targets, and you're not limiting yourself to just maybe larger fish. You know, I kind of feel that way across the board. If I can throw a lipless or that war pig in the 1/4 ounce, I usually will throw it in the 1/4 ounce. Same thing, jerk baits. You know, I usually won't go much bigger than that 110 size. I'll usually stay smaller even if I can get away from it. But with the swim bait, the key for me with a swim bait is I like to fish it on as light a head as possible. You know, in this case, you know, this little guy is just on a 3/16 ounce. I like to cast it, engage my reel, and I'll let that bait pendulum down to the bottom. And then once it hits the bottom, I'll let it sit there for a second. You'll get a ton of bites when that bait hits the bottom and sits on the bottom. If I don't get bit after a second or two, I'll crank it in maybe a 1/4 of the way back to the boat, and then I'll let it fall pendulum back to the bottom and just sit it on the bottom. And those fish, you'd be amazed how often you'll get fish during a shad spawn to bite when you're dead sticking that bait right on the bottom. And a swim bait is a great mimicking bait for that. Obviously, I use my little Matt Steffen Dirty Jigs Guppy head for that. So that's my third favorite. My next two are kind of what I consider a similar category. I've got a blade bait and a tail spinner. And both of these are similar to what I had just mentioned doing with the rattle trap. I like to cast this out, and I try to use the lightest size possible, and I'll let it fall to the bottom, let it sit, kind of pull it up again, reel it in 15 feet, let it fall back to the bottom. And a blade bait and a tail spinner are great presentations. You know, the tail spinners that I prefer are not like the lead body that you see a lot of them are. This is just kind of a plastic body, and it allows for a much slower fall through the water column. The blade bait, if it's windy out, the blade bait is hard to beat. You know, it's one of the easiest baits to maintain contact with and to keep in the strike zone. And it just mimics that dying shad perfectly. It's a great cold water bait, and a lot of it, you always hear people talk about that it's a great cold water bait, but a lot of that has to do with the shad spawn, and a blade bait just mimics that perfectly. The last bait that I like to throw is just a spy bait. You know, again, it has to do with being able to let that bait fall nice and slow like a dying shad, and it stands out because it's got the little props on the front and the back and will disperse a little bit of water. But you can let it fall to the bottom, slow retrieve it, it'll slowly rise. It's got a little bit of a wiggle. You can pause it and it kind of suspends and then slowly sinks. It's a really slow presentation, but if you know that you're around fish, it's a great bait to draw strikes during the shad spawn. So those are my baits of choice the next time you head out. And honestly, over the next several weeks here, there's going to be a major shad spawn going on throughout most of the country. So these are the baits that you want to have in your arsenal. From a color standpoint, I've got two trains of thoughts on it. One is match the hatch, so you want to use shad colored baits. The other is if you do happen to be in an area that is just overloaded with shad, like you can't get away from it, I like to go with something completely unnatural. You know, fire tigers, bright chartreuses, things that really will stand out. Orange and reds can be really good. Things that stand out amongst all of the natural shad can draw additional strikes as well. So keep that in mind too. But head out to the lake, grab your striker gear, dress warm, get out to the lake. You can catch them during the shad spawn, and you can catch some really big fish doing it. And on top of it, a lot of the fish are going to have huge guts and huge bellies, so they're going to weigh a lot. So you get out there, get yourself, you know, some of these baits, and just put your head down and go find some and catch them and enjoy it. You'll probably have a couple of weeks of this, and then it looks like we're going to have a lot warmer weather. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I appreciate it. If you like it, if you like the episode, hit that like button. If you've got other baits that you like to use during the shad spawn, please leave a comment. Share it with your friends on social media. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the water.